Hi, John Spritzler here from Boston. I'd like to say a few words about reparations and egalitarianism. Lately, I seem to see quite a bit of discussion about the need for reparations for the descendants of slaves in the United States and Native Americans, the descendants of people who were the victims of genocidal, horrible actions by the United States government in the past. And I completely agree. There should be reparations. The crime of chattel slavery and the crime of the genocidal violence against Native Americans, those crimes were monstrous, and the consequences, the negative consequences from those crimes persist today in the descendants of the people who in the past were the immediate victims. In the case of both Native Americans and black people, there is much greater poverty today as a result of those monstrous crimes than there would otherwise have been. The one statistic that reflects this that I'll mention is that the median wealth, the median net wealth of white families today is 13 times greater than the median net wealth of black families. And the reason for this is that as a result of being enslaved and being treated as if they were property ever since the initiation of slavery centuries ago, black families have not acquired and accumulated wealth in a way that white families were able to do. And so, a black person does not have a great-great-grandfather and grandmother, or grandmother and grandfather and mother and father who have the kind of wealth built up that a typical white person today has. When it comes to borrowing money to make a down payment on a mortgage, the white person has a family that can chip in a way that black families don't, and so forth. So the injustice is not something that only happened to people long ago. It's an injustice, the severe consequences of which are being borne by people living today. So there should be reparations. It's a monstrous crime, and like any monstrous crime, there should be reparations to the victims of it. But the question, of course, is how that should happen. And I advocate that the best solution, and I'm going to argue it's the only practical one as well that can actually be made to happen, is to have a revolution in our society that would result in all the descendants of the victims of those terrible crimes in the past having as good a material standard of living as the richest person in society's standard of living. I advocate that the Native Americans today and the black people today who are the descendants of slaves, that we should have our society such that they would be as well off, as materially secure and comfortable, and living with as much enjoyment in life as Bill Gates or the Walton family that owns Walmart, or the Koch brothers, or however you pronounce their name, or the Rockefellers, and so forth. They should be just as well off materially as the richest person in the country. Well, what does that mean? That means that we should have an egalitarian revolution so that the economic principle is from each according to reasonable ability, to each according to need or reasonable desire, so that if any of the victims of these terrible crimes, the descendants of these terrible crimes in the past, is willing to contribute reasonably according to ability, which would depend on the circumstances. If they were a child, the reasonable contribution would be considered to be 0. If they were, for some reason, incapable of working, likewise, 0. If they were going to school, that would be considered a reasonable contribution. And if they put in what's considered to be a reasonable amount of time in some economic enterprise, that would be considered a reasonable contribution. And even if they're willing to do that, and for some reason there's no opportunity for them to do it, that would still make them a person who was contributing reasonably, and that means that they could go to the store and take what they need for free, what they need or reasonably desire for free, get services that they need or reasonably desire for free, get housing, car, toys for the kids, vacation, etc., with as much access as the richest person in the country. Bill Gates, for example. Of course, Bill Gates would no longer own, vast amounts of wealth. He would be like everybody else. He would be a person who, in exchange for contributing reasonably according to ability, would be able to do what I was just describing, take what he needs or reasonably desires for free. But no one could be a hog. No one could go into a grocery store and load up their truck with every steak in the supermarket, with some selfish intention to, get rich by selling them or something. But people could go into the store and take the food that they reasonably desire or need to, make good meals for their family. And if things are scarce, then they would be rationed equitably according to need. That's what we do with fancy restaurants, right? We ration by having a call-in system. You have to make a reservation. Things like that. It's no big deal. Anyway, if we had this kind of egalitarian revolution to make an egalitarian society, then there would be justice for the descendants of the victims of the horrible crime of genocide against the Native Americans and chattel slavery. And it would also, of course, be a wonderful society for everybody else. I mean, Bill Gates might object, but the vast majority of people would have a much better world to live in. Materially, they would have the kind of security that most people are worried about not having today. And I could only begin to talk about the ways life would be socially so much better, because we would not be living under a dictatorship of the rich as we are today. A dictatorship which, to maintain the social and class and economic inequality, is required to treat ordinary people like dirt and to pit us against each other by making us believe lies about each other. For example, by making white people think that black people are a criminal race, which is what the purpose of the war on drugs is all about, to disproportionately arrest black and Hispanic people for drugs. So we would be living in a world where people would feel that they could be in a relationship of mutual trust and support, mutual aid, rather than feeling resentful of other groups of people, which of course is exactly what affirmative action was designed to produce by the dictatorship of the rich. That's why we've had decades of white people being told, "I'm sorry, we couldn't give you the position you applied for in a job or school because we had to give it to a less qualified minority person. Decades of that have produced terrible resentment and mistrust between black and white people, and this makes it a rotten society to live in compared to the friendly relations that would exist if we had an egalitarian society. So that's what I'm advocating, and I'm also advocating as part of reparations, an extremely important part of reparations, that there be an enormous number of films and museums and school curricula and so forth that would tell the public the truth about chattel slavery and Jim Crow that followed it and the genocide of Native Americans, and would not, cover it up with, some effort to make it seem as if America's rulers were really not that bad. They were that bad, and they knew exactly what they were doing, and it was for purely selfish, greedy reasons that they created chattel slavery and launched the genocide of Native Americans. But the other part of the truth is that ordinary people of European descent may have been lied to about blacks and Native Americans, and they may have believed those lies, and for that reason they may have gone along with the horrible crimes that the upper class committed, but they were not the ones benefiting from it. There's a big difference, and these museums and films that are part of the reparations should explain the enormous difference between the people who deliberately concocted racist lies for selfish reasons to benefit their upper class selfish aims versus the people who naively believed those lies, but whose lives were actually made worse, not better, by what the upper class was doing. What I mean is that the enslavement of black people did not benefit ordinary white people. The left says, white privilege, but the privilege means a benefit, and it is no benefit to an ordinary white working class person to have his or her solidarity with other working class people of a different race destroyed, so that neither race of working class person is able to effectively challenge the power of the upper class that is oppressing them both. That's not a benefit, that's a harm. The numbers pointed out the wages of white workers in the Jim Crow South were lower than the wages of workers in the North, not higher. Jim Crow did not benefit the poor whites. It was part of a system of preventing them from gaining the solidarity with the blacks. That was the only way that they could challenge the power of the upper class, as they did in some occasions. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union was an integrated union in the Cotton Belt South in the 1930s that successfully waged enormous strikes against the big landowners to improve their conditions and pay. And they did it by having integrated union meetings with blacks and whites together that the Ku Klux Klan attacked and that the Jim Crow laws made illegal. So reparations would point out that the crimes that we're talking about, the enslavement and the genocide, were carried out for the benefit of an upper class, not for the benefit of ordinary white people. And that the emotional response of ordinary white people to these horrible crimes should not be guilt, which is what the ruling class tries to make us think it should be. No, it should not be guilt, it should be anger. Anger at the upper class for what it did to all working class people of all races. And so that leads me to the last point I want to make, which is that we live in a dictatorship of the rich, and the rich might very well give lip service to the idea and say, oh yes, we need reparations, but they're only going to do it in a way that will be effective in divide and rule. They will propose something which they know will cause great resentment of white Americans against blacks and Native Americans. They will do something like say, we're going to tax the hell out of white Americans and give the money to descendants of slaves and Native Americans, and they won't really improve the lives of the descendants of the crimes, but they will whip up an enormous amount of resentment. It will be like throwing red meat at the right-wing talk radio hosts, you know, and I've seen it already start. You know, you can see some posts here and there on Facebook and so forth, you know, where people post things like, well, you know, I'm a descendant of Irish people, and the Irish were treated like dirt and were essentially slaves themselves when they were kidnapped from Ireland, and other Brits were kidnapped from Britain and sent to the new colonies in chains and bought like chattel and mostly died before their indenture period was over and so forth. And that's true. That did happen. And people have a right to be very angry about it. And there should be reparations for that, too. And what I'm proposing would be reparations for that, because the currently living descendants of those people who were so horribly treated, European people, would, like the descendants of slaves and Native Americans, have an equal standard of living with everybody else for the first time. But of course the ruling class would never advocate that kind of unifying approach to reparations. They're going to say, oh no, the white people have to be made to suffer because they were not the descendants of slaves, and they're going to suffer so that the descendants of slaves can have more, and they'll create as much divisiveness as the rich want to create that way. It's a policy that I think they're sort of keeping in their hip pocket to pull out when they feel that they want to ramp up the divisiveness even more. So now some people say, well, you know, we shouldn't take the money from ordinary white people. We should take the money from the rich and give it to the descendants of the victims of those past crimes. Well, the rich, we have a dictatorship of the rich. The rich are not going to allow them to have their wealth taken away to give to the descendants of the victims of past crimes. They're not going to willingly allow it. To get money from the rich in that kind of scale, a scale worth talking about, not just some token little diddly amount, requires a revolution. And to make a revolution, we need tremendous unity of the vast majority of the population. And to have that unity, we have to have a goal which is unifying. So again, we need the goal that expresses what most people want, which is to remove the rich from power, to have real, not fake democracy, with no rich and no poor, i.e. what I was saying earlier, from each according to ability to each according to need kind of economy, which, by the way, is not even based on money. Money is an exchange of equal for equal. If you have a lot, you can exchange it and get a lot. If you don't have anything, you can exchange the little you have and get only a little. No, I'm talking about people who contribute according to reasonable ability can get everything they need or reasonably desire, and that's not done with money. That's done by having what I call a sharing economy. Anyway, my latest book has a chapter about reparations, and I hope that you'll go online and see this book and my other book, which is called No Rich and No Poor. And this book is Divide and Rule. And I hope you'll keep watching these videos to hear about different aspects of egalitarianism. Thank you.